Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of In the Pit with Lobo Tigre. Our victim of the day is Jamie Beck. He's the president of Filo Mining, which some of you may recall has one of the Lundin Group's big copper gold discoveries in South America, formerly with No Guts, No Glory exploration. So, Jamie, you inherited this big deposit, and why don't you go ahead and tell us, give us the overview. What do you plan to do with it?
Thanks, Lobo, and thanks for having me on. So you've summarized it pretty well. Filo Mining is advancing the Filo del Sol project in Chile and Argentina. This is a Lundin Group company, so that comes with the backing of the family who are major shareholders. This is a South American focused copper vehicle and was spun out of NGX Resources in 2016. And the thinking behind that was that NGX had made a couple of big discoveries in the area, and Filo had never sort of had the focus put on that company and that project specifically. So this was a chance to roll it into a different vehicle, attract new investors to come in and support Filo. So since about that time in 2016, we've been advancing the project, continuing to drill it off. In January of 2019, we put out a pre-feasibility study on the project. And Filo is broadly broken into two big parts, I guess you could call it. There's an oxide portion of the deposit, and most of the focus to date has been on drilling off that oxide portion. The pre-feasibility study focused entirely on that oxide portion and led to a heap leach operation. And simultaneous with that, we always believed that below the that sort of epithermal system, we also were into a big copper gold porphyry system. So we started doing some deep drilling at Filo. 2018-19 season, we put our first kilometer deep hole into the ground, and it was mineralized top to bottom and completely outside of the open pit that was defined by the pre-feasibility study. So that really got us thinking that potentially we're onto something at Filo that's much bigger than what we've already pieced together. We followed that up with some drilling this past season, and we've now got 3 holes in excess of a kilometer deep that span a north-south distance of over a kilometer. We're starting to see some really interesting grades with this deeper drilling that's underneath our existing resource. So the plan at Filo is to continue to try and swing for the fences. We're going to see if we can find the edges of this system and get a sense of how big it really is sitting underneath what's already a robust pre-feasibility study.
Okay, well, that's an admirably succinct summary, and I do remember, actually, now that you mention it, I remember back in the NGX days how Filo was just sort of also in the portfolio, so that makes sense. And I have a bunch of questions about what you just said, but
Sure.
first and foremost, that border situation, you're literally on the border, and how do you avoid ending up with Pascua Lama type problems, Lama Pascua as the Argentines like to call it?
Yeah.
It sounds confusing.
So the project sits right on the border, and most of the mineralization defined to date is in Argentina. So probably 90% of the resource sits in Argentina, maybe 10% flops into Chile. But any development is going to require development and working jointly with both the Chilean and the Argentine regulatory environment. And very similar to Pascua Lama, we are part of what we call the Binational Treaty Protocol. It's got a much longer name down there. But it exists between Chile and Argentina for exactly this reason. The two countries got together. They realized, we've got a number of assets that sit really close here, and we're going to need to work together or nothing's going to get developed. So even in the early days, NGX originally and now Filo Mining, we would go to these binational meetings, and largely it was ourselves and Beck with Pascua Lama driving the bus. And I think if we take a look at the challenges, and I'm no expert on what happens at Pascua Lama or what the problems were with that project, but largely, I don't believe those had to do with the binational treaty and the inner workings between Chile and Argentina. I think that came down to some challenges from the environmental side on the way they followed through with some obligations that were made in Chile. So we don't view that as a challenge. In fact, it's been a real benefit to our project. We've been able to access it from both sides. We can staff it from people in Chile. We can staff it from people in Argentina. We tend to ship our core down and store it in Chile, but we have lots of drilling and the supply lines coming from Argentina. So, as this moves towards development and as we work further, we'll have to continue environmental permitting on both sides of the border and make sure that we're following along with each country's guidelines. But we don't see that as a huge issue or roadblock to getting this into production.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll have to see. It's one of those things that how many deposits are right on a border? And the one example that comes to mind is Pascualama, which
Right.
famously had trouble. But you're right, I do recall that, A, the Argentines were pretty much okay with it, and B, the problem on the Chilean side really wasn't about the border. They did have environmental issues. And
Yeah.
It does look, I mean, you're far too polite to say it, but it does kind of look like Beck fell on its face there. And did
One of the interesting things, I guess, about our project is that the balance may be a little bit better here. Most of the resource in Argentina, most of the development in Argentina as well. So where we've come up with our plant site, where we've come up with infrastructure, power line corridors, all of that kind of stuff, it's mostly located in Argentina. So in terms of how we ran the economic model, if a block came out of the Chilean side, we paid taxes and royalties to Chile. If it came out of Argentina, we paid taxes and royalties to Argentina. So I guess the feeling, at least in terms of the way the deposit sits, the way that the infrastructure to date is planned for the pre-feasibility study, there's a bit more balance there.
And does having the preponderance on the Argentine side actually make it easier to get water? I mean, water on the Chilean side is always such a big issue.
It's a huge advantage for this project. We drilled off for groundwater in Argentina over the past 2 seasons, a number of wells. There's abundant groundwater there. So our ability to draw groundwater probably saves a $500 million capital expenditure in terms of desalination facility, pumping it from the coast of Chile all the way up into Argentina, and then figuring out exactly what you're going to do with all of that water afterwards.
Sure. Well, that actually sort of tags into my next question. You've got this great big copper gold deposit, copper gold silver. You got all together. You can't do this, but I can as an evil scum of the earth newsletter writer. You've got 4.2 billion pounds of copper, 6.2 million ounces of gold, almost 200 million ounces of silver. Half of that in proven and probable. But the grade is kind of low, and they're not exceptionally low for the region. There are a lot of these big, giant bulk tonnage deposits there. But if you take the metals separately, 0.3 and 0.3 roughly on the copper and the gold, 10 grams silver, it's really not a lot. So it needs those economies of scale. And so the water begins to answer my question, which was the PFS, and not even a PEA, it's a PFS. It has an after-tax internal rate of 23%. And you've got these bulk grades, at elevation up there in the Andes. How do you get 23% IRR out of a project that big? I mean, the capital is going to be huge, and I can just think of a million things that would make it, maybe profitable. But 23 seems high. What do you attribute that to?
The fact that it's an oxide resource, and that we're able to process this using a low-cost heap leach method. So the processing route planned for Filo, at least the oxide portion of the deposit, is to take a look at a sequential heap leaching. So instead of having to install big SAG grinding mills and crush the stuff down to microns, we're able to crush it to sort of a very reasonable sized, rocks and stones, which then get stacked on leach pads and sprinkled with, at least for the copper leach, sprinkled with a very mild water acid solution. And then it gets picked up and moved on to a gold silver leach pad after some neutralization. And then we pull out the gold and silver. So having a very low cost, low capital intensive flow sheet is a huge reason that drives the economics at Filo.
Oh, that
And
does
very
make sense.
different from a lot of the projects that are out there. And this isn't new in the area. Some of the biggest mines in Chile started off as an oxide processing facility, and some of them are still operating like that. Zaldivar, for example, Chuquicamata had a huge oxide portion to it before it moved into the sulfides. Quebrada Blanca is another example of a project that's been operating as a copper oxide deposit for many years, and are only now sort of entering into their big development to access the sulfides at QB. So this is a typical process in the life cycle of a mine up here.
And you'd actually move the ore, you'd stack it and then move it to another one. Why not? Get the copper out here, start stacking the next one, get the copper out here, and then just change the chemistry on the first one.
From a safety perspective, we need to make sure that we don't get any cyanide mixing with the acid solution, because that can be an issue. So the key is really making sure that we get excellent rinsing, washing, and neutralization of the acid portion of the process that happens on the copper pad before we stack it on the gold heap leach pad. And fortunately, the kinetics of the process work in our favor. The copper comes out really quickly. So we have that on a dynamic pad where the copper goes on. It sits there for about 14 days, 21 days, and then we pull it off and move it onto the gold pad where it stays there for its remaining life.
Yeah, that's pretty quick. Well, so on that subject, I noticed that your gold price assumption looks great, wonderfully conservative now, 1,300 gold, but your copper price assumption is $3, silver's 20. Maybe longer term copper's abnormally low, so the $3 isn't really that aggressive, but it is above spot. And with the global economy, dealing with the COVID shutdowns and so on. Do you think that price is really justified, or do you put out a scenario with a lower copper price just to have that base covered, or how do you deal with that?
It's the challenge always with these studies, isn't it, Lobo, that you lock down a moment in time and have a view of what metals prices look like at that point, but the numbers change, and that's why in every worthwhile study, I think you need to take a look at the sensitivities. I'd encourage all of your investors to flip open our study if you're interested in that, and run through what it looks like at different varying gold prices, varying copper prices. The challenge is that once you start tweaking those assumptions, it changes with how the open pit even looks and how your mining sequence might go. So, you have to keep running through these scenarios and adjusting as you move forward. I guess our view within the Lundin Group is quite bullish on copper. This isn't a project that gets built at today's copper price. This is a project that gets built when copper's $3 or probably north thereof. And, without getting into the supply demand fundamentals of copper in depth, we have a strong view that copper is going to be going higher in the future. And there's a really bullish case for that. So we're happy with $3 being used in the study, and think that that's probably a reasonable price point to consider when a project like this gets built.
All right. So on that subject, I mean, you guys, you have the Lundin backing, Lundin Mining. They know what they're doing in the copper space, obviously. So you could build this if you needed to, wanted to. Is there a general sense, what's the corporate goal here? Is it to sell it off like Regalito and all these other copper discoveries down there, sell it to the Chinese or whoever? Or do you guys actually want to go ahead or maybe you get taken over by Lundin Mining or something? But is there a, corporate isn't the right word because it's more than one corporation. Is it the Lundin Group? Is there an objective here to actually build this mine and make money off of it? Or is this really hopefully a takeover scenario where you prove it up and sell it to some larger company?
It's a really good question, and I don't think that there's an answer I can give other than the goal here is to try and make money for shareholders. And if you talk to Lucas or you talk to any one of his companies, I can imagine that's going to be his answer. He doesn't have a view necessarily that this has to be built, but if this is something that we feel like the best value for shareholders is going to be us taking it ourselves and pursuing that construction path. And yeah, I think this is within the wheelhouse of the group. Lundin Gold's a prime example of a company that's just started something from the ground up, almost $1 billion, raised a bunch of money through equity, put together an attractive debt financing package, brought in a strategic partner in Newcrest. So I think executing on a project of this size and scale is something that's well within the group's capability. And
sure. Well,
I guess
at least for the oxide
broadly,
portion, I'd give you that for the oxide portion. If you're drilling kilometer-long holes, a kilometer apart, and you get like a Caspiche or a Cerro Casale type situation, I mean, that might be a bit of a stretch even for the Lundins. Maybe not. I mean, it's a big group, and you could pull resources together, but that's
what we're trying to figure out right now. And we've spent a bunch of time talking about the oxide project, and we are excited about that. But really, the story at Filo, and I think the reason that somebody might get involved in the story today is the upside that we're trying to prove out with this deep drilling. It was a very conscious effort from our part at management as well as the board to say, we've got this great oxide project that sits on top, but what we don't know is what sits underneath. And we'd be remiss to do a deal with one of the majors or a strategic partner at this stage without fully understanding what we're sitting on. And also potentially run into a problem where we advance a feasibility study and we get a whole bunch of engineering work done, and we find that we've got the leach pads in the wrong spot, and they've sterilized the ultimate development of the sulfide project here. So these, this deep drilling, we think there's a real potential here at Filo to piece together what could be one of the largest copper gold resources, undeveloped resources in the Andes. And just the size and scale of the system is remarkable. So our focus now is on trying to drill that out. And if that means that we end up with billions of tons of resource and one of the majors comes knocking and there's an opportunity for us to do something that makes sense for shareholders, for sure we'll look at that.
All right, so I'll invite you to do a little arm waving here. You've got a couple of pierce points a kilometer apart. Is there geophysics that says it's much bigger, or is that the lateral extent, or how big could this be? This is a freebie. Tell me, how big could this be?
Well, I can't, without having the drill results in hand, obviously I can't answer the question. What I can say is that, one of the holes that we drilled a few years ago is an RC hole 93. And it's virtually 2 kilometers north of anything else that we've done to date in terms of the deep drilling. And that was a hole we were looking for oxide resource. We drilled it down to 400, 500 meters, didn't hit any oxide, so we stopped the hole. But in going back and taking a look at the geochemistry there and getting the analysis back, we're into really, really decent copper gold sulfide grades at the bottom of that hole. So we had a plan to re-drill that. It's hole 39, I believe, in our diamond hole 39. And if you would take a look at our presentation and a plan map, it's a kilometer north of the drilling that we released this past season. And if we can continue the kinds of grades that we were hitting in our deeper drilling this year to the north of that kilometer, I guess to put it in perspective, each kilometer square of potential mineralization has about 3 billion tons of mineralization in it. So if we're 2, 3, 4 kilometers in strike north and south, and we're about a kilometer east-west, you can do the math. There's potential there for...
Well, and if it goes a kilometer down, you're not really talking square kilometers, you're talking cubic kilometers.
Exactly.
All right. So, yeah, that's a worthy goal. All right. So what's the plan for this year? What's the budget? How many holes will you drill, and how far will you get towards defining that?
The plan is to try and go back up and finish off what was cut short from our drill season last year. Obviously 2020 is turning out to be an interesting year. we had to curtail our drilling activities probably about a month earlier than we wanted to, pull people back out of camp and make sure that they got home safe and sound.
And
So
we should note
pandemic,
it is winter in South America right now. So
it is right now, yeah, but our drilling typically runs to early April, mid-April, and we cut that short around mid-March as a result of the pandemic. So the plan is to get back up there and finish off what we started. We have 4 holes that were completed to varying depths of 150 to almost 350 meters. We'll see whether or not we can try and re-enter those holes, and hope to try and get those down to that kilometer target depth or deeper during the 2020-21 season. So we'll need to raise a bit of money to get back up there and finish that off. And are targeting approximate 4,000, 5,000 meter program, which should accomplish the goals. And I think with that in hand,
let's come back to that. Let me ask you. I mean, it sounds like you're being fairly cautious. I mean, you're not. This isn't some 20, 30 hole program where you're going to drill off all these square kilometers. You're still trying to scope out the location and orientation of this mineralization. Is that fair to say? So you're testing but not going gangbusters is what I'm hearing.
Yeah. I think there's going to be a big program that has to follow after this in terms of infill and proving up the size and scale of the resource. Right now, our goal is to try and hit the boundaries, to try and get a sense of, okay, is it this big? Is it this big? Is it this big? Where do we find the edges of this, both in terms of north-south distance as well as at depth? And that's what we're going to try and accomplish this season, and hopefully are successful, which will lead into what would be a decision point then, Lobo, as to, do we say, you know what, we've proven we've got this big resource, that's good enough, let's focus on the oxide, it's going to be the pre-strip here anyways, it has to come off first, let's move this towards feasibility study? Or does that entice a partner or somebody else to come in and we start spending millions of dollars drilling this off and putting together a big sulfide resource?
So how much would this year's drill program cost then? You guys had, at least according to your financials, you had $6.5 million in the bank or so at the end of March. So it's not like you're scraping the bottom of the barrel.
No, but we have a few bills that roll in after the end of the drill season. So, that will largely be chewed up from the previous season's drilling. So we'll need to raise cash in order to move forward on a 5,000 meter program this year. We're targeting probably in the order of 10 to 12 million Canadian in order to do that. We do have access to a debenture with the Lundin family, which we'll put in place or extend for a year. That's completely undrawn, and it's a $5 million US facility. So that gives us a bit of time to try and make sure that we've got the right window and the price looks right for raising equity.
I mean, at $2 a share, it's not too hard to raise money here. If you were a penny stock, it would be a very different conversation.
Yeah.
But on that point, maybe a downside to the Lundin Group involvement is that they have such deep-pocketed friends. It's pretty easy for a Lundin company to raise a whack of cash with no warrant, and sometimes it's brokered and there's no room for retail. So if you're not allowed to comment, don't. But I got to ask, if you're going to need more money to do this, would there be a seat at the table for retail investors potentially? Would there be a non-brokered component?
Oh, I think there's always a seat at the table for retail investors, and certainly if there was appetite there to bring people in, for sure. Our last deal that we did was through BMO. It was a bought deal, and that was sort of sectioned off into 2 parts. So the family did their part, and then there was almost a $40 million raise. Family did their part and took approximately half of it, but the remainder was out there for any shareholders who wanted to participate. That raise was August of 2019 that we did that at $2.75. So, always space for retail investors, and we're keen to get more people into the story and interested in Filo Mining.
Yeah, I noticed actually that all of your options are either slightly to somewhat out of the money. So there's, and if the last financing was at 275, there's a big incentive of everybody who's in already to help the share price go up and keep dilution to a minimum. So I get that. I guess actually before we keep on with the money theme, I did have one other question about the the big elephant that you're looking for there. And I'm wondering if you've done any early metallurgy on some of the drill samples that you got out of those deep holes, and do you have any sense for, would this be a pretty straightforward, grind and float, or would it need, more intensive processing? Do you know yet?
No, we don't. We don't know yet. We are planning probably to do a little bit of work during this summer. We've got some of the coarse rejects and some core available to take a look at some early stage metallurgy, but we haven't touched that yet. In general, and we've got a bit of information from very close by deposits, Los Salados in Chile from NGX, and Jose Maria a little bit to the north, which is now in Jose Maria Resources. So they're more classic copper gold porphyry systems, which is exactly the kind of a rock we're seeing at the bottom of some of this deep drilling. And the metallurgy that we've seen on those deposits has been excellent. So our view is that this is likely going to be fairly classic crush, grind, float work, and we'll see how what we need to do through those often tricky transition zones.
All right. Well, that makes sense, and I think I have a pretty good view of what you're going after this summer. And I guess some of our viewers will be watching for any news of a financing to see what the terms might be for retail investors. But the one question I always have to ask everybody is the skin of the game question. If you're going to persuade me as an investor to put my money in the stock, I want to know how much of your money you've put into it. So what can you tell us?
Board and management here, and it's always comes back to how much skin you have in the game exactly. And Lucas has between the family trusts 36% ownership in this. They tend to invest alongside with every raise, taking half, if not more. So if you take a look at board and management into this story, it's close to 40%. I'm a shareholder as well. And we'll continue to try and add to my position, especially at these prices. So I think it's well supported, and I hope that other shareholders out there see that the management and the board are pretty well aligned with making this a success.
Fair enough. You say adding at these prices. Are you buying on the open market, or?
I would like to be if I had some money.
Well, maybe you get that discovery bonus there and deploy it.
Exactly. No, I think as we're talking about things like raising some money and planning for our next field seasons, as you can imagine, Lobo, we have to be pretty careful at what we're doing because we're often blacked out and we can't really show our hands. But it's a great story, and I think we're super excited about getting back up there next season and carrying on with what we thought was really good results this past year.
All right. Okay. Well, thank you. You've been a pretty good sport for some obnoxious questions here, Jamie, and I appreciate it. And I get it. We'll be watching, and we wish you luck.
Thanks, Lobo.